giving the cricket scores, talking about the weather and things like that. And then he plays a little music, and then it comes back, and he starts talking about a crowd that seems to be forming in London that reporting unruly demonstrators who in Trafalgar Square who were led by a Mr. Poppleberry, the secretary of the National Movement for the Abolition of Theater Cues. He then goes back, after he announces that this is happening, he shifts back to music and more scores and things like that. Then it starts jumping back increasingly that this group is becoming unruly, and they now are attacking birds on the St. James Park Lake. And then a man comes by who apparently is coming to the BBC for an interview, and they capture him, they kill him, they basically burn him alive, and he's announcing all this as this goes on. And then it continues to escalate until finally this crowd is rushing through, they're attacking Parliament, they're getting out mortars, they start bombing the Big Ben, and at one point he announces that because of all of this happening, Greenwich time will not be given this evening by Big Ben, but will be given from Edinburgh on Uncle Leslie's watch. And he's doing all of this in this crisp English accent with a slight Scottish brogue, telling it very straightforward and so on. And then ultimately it ends up with him hanging the transport secretary from a lamppost. He then closes the broadcast, goes home, and it's only after that they find out that they've been getting all of these calls, people having, fainting and things like that. No armies were called out or anything like that. But the theory is that John Houseman was in the UK somewhere around the time that this was happening. But they say that he left the UK before then, but it also made the New York Times and was reported there and so on. And some people had thought that maybe Wells and Koch and so on had gotten sort of the idea for something along this line from maybe this particular broadcast. But anyway, moving on, what I wanted to do is kind of do this in a little bit of a timeline. Of course, in 1938 was when the panic broadcast took place. And then by 1946, as it was beginning to kind of flow into the everyday with people being aware of Martians invading and so on, Bob Clampett created a cartoon called Kitty Corner, in which he utilizes just a little bit of the concept around the Mars broadcast. Oh, you got a good. Okay, so we'll go ahead and play this. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but
program to bring you a special news bulletin. Flash, country overrun by men from Mars. Millions of Martians are landing in our fields. Strange creatures are dropping from the stratosphere. Crisis in Washington. President asked people to be calm. Everything's going bad, I tell you. Utterly bad. Stay tuned into the station for late reports. Hey, what does the man say, mister? What do the man say?
He says a million men from Mars are landing on the Earth. But that's silly. Well, good night. Good night. Good night, Butterball. Men from Mars! Look at there. Pardon me, but does anyone in the audience know somebody who knows somebody that has a house to rent?
So anyway, okay. Jumping ahead here, there were other little elements that came along, but since I don't have a lot of clips for these things, I'm not going to mention that much. The first real panic broadcast that came about as a result after the fact was in 1949, actually 1944, in Santiago, Chile. There was a redo of the War of the Worlds. It was actually based on a script written by an American who in fact was living down there and actually had been a radio scriptwriter. He wrote a version, basically taking the same Orson Welles thing, localizing it to Santiago, Chile, and I guess it resulted in, at least supposedly, one person died. The army was called out, running around trying to figure out where the Martians were, and so on. Then in 1949, in Quito, Ecuador, once more, a series of guys got together and they did the same basic type of a thing. But there's, the interesting thing about that was that as they broadcast this and the armies were being called out, people were starting to panic and so on. Ultimately, once the people began to realize what was going on and that it was the station that was doing this, they actually stormed the station and they started throwing basically fire bombs at the station, set it on fire, burned the whole, it was the news department, it was a newspaper department as well as a radio station, and they burnt the whole thing down. I think 12 people died, mostly from the fire. I did have a clip, but I'm not going to play it right now. It was just, if you guys listen, anybody listens to NPR, sometime back, NPR, there's a program called Radio Lab, and they did a thing on War of the Worlds, and they actually interviewed the daughter of, I guess, the last man out of the building, and she kind of explained how he got all burned up and stuff like that. So, but there's no actual broadcast of that actually exists, unfortunately. Moving forward then, it began to move into the movies and so on. George Powell made his movie in 1953, and Lux Radio did a presentation in 1955, basically all based around the new George Powell version. Most of you are aware, in 1957, Studio One did a broadcast called The Night America Trembled. I do have a clip of that, but again, because we're short on time, I want to jump ahead here for a minute. How many people are familiar with the Studio One Night America Trembled? Have you ever seen that? Okay, maybe I should show a piece of that. Okay. Yeah.
Yes, Edward R. Murrow was involved with that. It was the premiere episode of, I think, the second to last season of the series. And it was basically fictional news coverage also of the broadcast.
Westinghouse Studio One.
Well, maybe it's not going to show it.
Since we're up to the 1950s, when they did, they were planning to do Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the producer of the film wrote to Welles and his agent and actually proposed a number of times with different scripts to have Orson Welles introduce the film, mentioning War of the Worlds, and do the narration. They went back and forth, tossed dollar signs. The shorter the scripts, the sentence or two less, the less the money it was. And ultimately, he never ended up getting to do the narration. But a couple of the proposed ideas was to actually have him mention and bring up the fact that when he scared America with War of the Worlds. So some producers years later, even in the 50s, were trying to promote and make some money on that idea.
Out of the vision of America's most advanced engineers, out of the widest kind of experience in electrical. You can see it now. It's staff of the Mercury Theater on the air. We're putting the final touches to what was frankly a terror tale, which was to go on the air within a few short minutes. We see them now in the final moments of rehearsal with their director.
Actually, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here to when they actually begin the broadcast, because this carries on. It jumps around to people at home, it shows people at home, and getting ready to go out, and things like that. So let me just skip ahead here to...
You'll recognize a few faces up here. Besides Ed Asner, you also see a very young Warren Beatty. If we see a clip that has a minute.
No, you won't see Warren Beatty. What you are going to see, you might see James...
Over.
See,